Welcome, everyone. My name is Todd Rossnagel, and welcome to today's webinar. It's great to have everyone along with us. We want to thank each and every one of you for carving out time on this Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We know you have other things to do, so thank you very much for being here. This is the first of 3 webinars by the Louisiana Conference and our friends at Project Curate. Again, my name is Todd Rossnagel. It's great to have everyone with us. I'm going to go over some housekeeping rules and then kick it to our guests. These webinars will be discussions surrounding racial injustice and the work that we are all called to. This is Module 1, Whiteness 101. Next Thursday is Module 2, White Fragility and White Supremacy. And then the Thursday after that is Module 3, Blackness and Anti-Blackness 101. All of these webinars are going to be at 2 o'clock. It's important to note that next week it is going to be on Thursday and then the Thursday after that. It is just us here in this Zoom webinar. We are not broadcasting to Facebook, but we are recording this, and we will place the entire series on our YouTube channel and on our website when this is completed. Your mics are muted, your cameras are off. This is for the express purpose of focusing on the hosts and keeping the distractions at a minimum. But we want your questions. That's how our time together will be extremely fruitful. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. When you submit your question, we will collect them, and we'll get to some of them a little bit later in our time together, and perhaps in the midst of our time together, we'll get to some of your questions. If you want to submit a question via email, you can do that as well. Our email is communications@la-umc.org. We'll have that in the chat window, and we'll have plenty of time to go through your questions. Well, as you saw in the opening video, as United Methodist Christians, we do have an obligation to bear a faithful witness to the reality and harm that racism has brought to our communities and to one another. And to fulfill this obligation, we must address racism with great intentionality and through the lens of the Christian faith. In this webinar, we hope to frame that conversation and help all of us. Our hosts are our friends from Project Curate, a nonprofit and consultancy that works with religious, academic, and community organizations to support collaborative responses to intersectional issues of inequality and injustice. They're fantastic. Reverend Dr. Matt Russell, who currently serves as pastor at Chapelwood United Methodist Church in Houston, Dr. Rachel Schneider, who is a scholar of religion, race, and culture, as well as a community social justice advocate based in Houston. And also joining us, we're happy to have Reverend Dr. Mark Boswell with us. He is the executive director of the faith-based nonprofit Together for Hope in Lake Providence, Louisiana. He's ordained with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And finally, Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey, who serves as the bishop for the Louisiana Conference. In connection with her Episcopal assignment, she is also president of the Council of Bishops. And we'd like to swing it over to Bishop Harvey, who will start us with an opening word, some brief remarks, and then, of course, prayer as well. So Bishop Harvey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, as we expand the table to this very, very important conversation as we deal with what it means to be white in this time, and certainly in this particular specific time in our history. As we've talked about in many other webinars and contexts and communications we've had with you, is that racism is antithetical to the gospel. So as people of faith, we bring that lens to everything that we do and everything that we say. So this webinar is expanded. We had our first with clergy, sort of a family meeting. This was now expanded to include laity and clergy. And I'm grateful to Project Curate and all the behind the scenes work that happens to make this happen in such a great way. I pray that our time together will be fruitful. These are important conversations. They're not easy conversations, but they're critical conversations for us to have. So if I could open us with a word of prayer, and I won't take up any more time, because I think the time with Project Curate and your questions are really, really important. So let's pray. Come, Holy Spirit, come. We come with grateful hearts for the privilege to be together, and we give thanks that in mystery, you are ever present in our lives. You bring to us new life. You call us to it, and you bring hope out of despair, joy in hard times. So help us in this time to feel your unseen hand, holding us, stirring us, and when we need it, even prodding us. Open our eyes that we may see and experience anew your goodness and your love. Amen.
Yes, so wonderful to be here with you all today. I'm just grateful, so grateful for Bishop Harvey and the Louisiana Conference for having the courage to have this very important conversation, and for all of you showing up and signaling your own interest and commitment to wrestle with our response as Christians to racism. And really understanding our place in this work of anti-racism. So broadly speaking, at Project Curate, our work is really aimed at imagining, striving for, and living in a better world where justice, mercy, humility, and love are not just aspirations, but assumptions within our own community ethics, including our church communities. And our specific hope for this series is to better equip us as Christians to respond to racial injustice. We believe that the work of repairing racial inequities and confronting racism is especially important for white Christians. So today in our session and in the session next Thursday, we are going to give a broad overview of ideas and issues that can help those of us who are white better understand our roles and our responsibilities to confront racism as grace-filled people. So Todd, I don't know if you're able to get the slide deck going, but feel free to start that now and move to the next slide. So why should we focus on whiteness? That's a question that comes up a lot in conversations about race where whiteness is named explicitly. Well, we believe at Project Curate that it is important for those of us who are white to wrestle with the realities of racial injustice, the ways that racism has alienated us from our own and others' humanity, and to take responsibility for our roles in creating change. It is also our belief that too often in conversations about race, Black and brown people are often asked to hold the emotional burden of educating their white siblings about race, while they also deal with the lived impact of racism. And so we feel like it is important for those of us who are white to take ownership over educating ourselves about race and wrestling with racism. That being said, at Project Curate, we prioritize centering the voices, experiences, and leadership of Black people and people of color. And so you will have a chance in 2 weeks' time to hear from our Black colleagues. I want to talk a little bit too about what this session and the next one are and what they're not. So it's not providing an exhaustive or definitive account of race or whiteness in 90 minutes. That would be an impossible task. This is such a huge topic, but it is a chance to engage with our racial conditioning and history in hopes of discerning how we can take the next step in creating flourishing communities that nourish and uplift all people. And it's an opportunity for us to imagine together specifically how we as white Christians can live into an anti-racist Christian future, one in which all who are created in the image of God feel welcomed and valued in their contributions and affirmed and included in their personhood. This webinar is intended to be challenging, but not shaming. So shame and guilt, and also sorrow and anger, can be natural parts of the process of waking up to racism. But shame is not the fuel of change. Rather, we root ourselves in the hope that as people of God, we can find sustaining life in, I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that we're still good on the webinar. I think I'm still all connected with you, so I'll continue. So again, I was saying that shame is not really the fuel that can create lasting and long-term change. So we root ourselves in the hope that as people of God, we can find sustaining life as we turn away from harmful ways of being and embrace new ways of being. And finally, our goal in this session is not to prescribe to those who are directly impacted by racial injustice and racism how to respond. We recognize humbly that Black Americans and so many other people of color have been struggling with the realities, the lived realities, the life and death realities of racism for centuries, and responding in ways that affirm their dignity and value. And they have so much wisdom and insight for us about how to address racism, and they are best equipped to teach us about how to address racism. So much of the information we're actually sharing with you is knowledge and experiences and wisdom that we've gleaned from our Black colleagues and friends and prophetic Black voices and other voices of people of color. So to conclude, before I pass it on to my colleagues, I just want to say that facing racism and embracing anti-racism is work that requires risk-taking. It takes a lot of courage to leave behind old ways of seeing and adopt new ways. And each of us, Mark, Matt, myself, we've been wrestling with these issues for years in our relationships and in our context. So we join you not necessarily as experts, although we do have expertise that we've developed over the years in formal study and other contexts and like our ministry context. But we do join you more so as co-journeyers because we're fully aware that it is an ongoing process for us to learn how to disavow racism and to confront our own blind spots and mistakes. So yes, it is sometimes very uncomfortable for white people to talk about race, in part because we've been conditioned not to see it and taught that it shouldn't be a factor in how we treat people. And so for that reason, sometimes when we talk about race and whiteness explicitly, it can feel very disorienting. It's okay if you feel disoriented or uncomfortable today, or you leave with more questions than answers. We invite you to really be open and lean into that discomfort. It's not danger. Sometimes that discomfort can really be the catalyst to change. And we also just want to acknowledge that from our own experiences, facing race and racism can be really confusing and hard and painful and scary and uncomfortable many times, because it is really hard things to face, and the realities are very heavy. But this is how we are transformed, how we open our minds, how we're renewed, how we create change. We first have to understand what the problem is. And we don't have to solve it, you know, in one person could not solve it completely, but we can discern together how we can take the next step. So I'm going to pass it to Matt now, who's going to just share a little bit more some of his thoughts about what's important for us to keep in mind as Christians as we enter this work.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm a United Methodist pastor in Houston, and so really come to this as all of us do, but have been really thinking about this and framing this in terms of discipleship. That really the work that we have in front of us is one that really lies at the heart of discipleship for our Christian faith and for us as United Methodists. And discipleship is learning from the ways of Jesus and apprenticing under his ways of living in the world. And so this is a radical call. I mean, Jesus shows up with his disciples, and really the call is to follow, to leave everything. What Dietrich Bonhoeffer says is he bids us to come and die is what Jesus is asking us. And so everything then in our relationship with Jesus is reoriented based on the kingdom of God, this idea, this power, this new relationships that are now living in and among us. And so it's not just about information that discipleship is centered on, but it really is about formation of our lives, the formation of who we are. And that we see what Jesus does in the world in the first century, which is to reorient social relationships differently. So much so that Paul ends up saying that in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave, nor free, nor male, nor female. All of these categories are upended and reconstituted. So at the heart of discipleship is that. And I think that where we are as a church is really the necessity of moving to say, what is God doing in the world, and what should the world look like? What would the world look like if all things were made new in Christ? Which is really what the call of the kingdom is. And what God calls us to. Often in our own churches, white churches, charity can look like folks that invite folks to the table and to participate in the table. All the while, power owns that table. And so I think discipleship at its core is about saying we've got to figure out a new way. There's where there is a mutuality in the ownership of that, and the ways that people have access to power. And so it really is a movement of mutuality where at the heart of that, we're not holding the power, but we are collectively sharing in that and shaping our future together in a much deeper way. And that's why I think this really relies at the heart of discipleship. Mark is going to talk about some important definitions and distinctions, and part of what we want to do today is just kind of give highlights and an overview, like Rachel said, and get a lot of information in the room. So I want to welcome Mark to this as well.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to start out today by telling just a little bit about my background and what led me to this work. When I grew up in Eastern North Carolina in a small rural Baptist congregation out in the country. And there were a couple of incidents that made a mark on me and that led me in the direction that I've since gone in both studying race and racism from a theological vantage point at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. That was the nature of my dissertation, my PhD program. But these incidents didn't start in the classroom per se. They started back at this little rural church I was a part of, that my family had been a part of for a long time. One incident was, I remember a time at which point a pastor at our church had gotten in a bit of trouble because he had asked the deacons and anyone else, the practice was a lot of the men would gather outside of the church on Sunday morning before worship started, and they would just hang around and talk and chit chat. And the pastor would sometimes walk out and join them. And he was disturbed at some point by how many racial slurs, or how often racial slurs would be used in the conversations, the N-word in particular. And so the pastor had to actually ask them to stop using the N-word on church grounds where visitors and other people would walk up and be part of the worship service. I mean, it was that commonplace, and this was still in the mid-90s or so, and he got in a bit of hot water for that. Another incident a few years later was that a Hispanic congregation wanted to explore the possibility of sharing some space with us at our building, at our church building. And a different pastor advocated for that and said, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. We were a small congregation. We used our building a couple times a week, and they were flexible. And nevertheless, people made it very, very clear that they did not want Hispanic folks in the church. And this pastor ended up losing his job for advocating for that. And it was a Baptist background and context, so they were able just to vote him out and to send him along. I say all that to say, over the years as I went to graduate school and seminary and this, that, and the other, I realized that the types of racism that I knew and had experienced would be considered by others to be more explicit and vulgar forms of racism, and that there are lots of other aspects and components conceptually to the types of racism that exist in our country and across regions and across places and different groups of people. And I found that it was helpful over time to get clear in my mind, what exactly we meant by certain words or phrases and conceptual categories that we use to think about race. Oftentimes the language gets very messy in our minds. And so what I'm going to walk us through now are just some basic words that we use a lot, like prejudice, bias, racism, and talk about what exactly we mean, and perhaps more so what scholars sometimes mean by those words, and that I believe that can help us in our conversations with others, and how we frame it in our minds and how we frame it with others as we engage people either in our congregations or our families or our communities. The first, before we get directly into one of those specific definitions, the first thing I want to throw out to you though is a book written by, the author's name is Matt Wray, and this would be included on the slide, and I could also put it in the chat later, but it's W-R-A-Y, Matt, like Matthew, Ray. And the book is called Not Quite White, so W-H-I-T-E, Not Quite White. And the book is about the history of white identity amongst various class strata of white people. So poor white people in particular is the group that he looks at, and he traces this historically. And he both looks at ways that class factors and identity were both used against poor white people, and then also used to drive a wedge between poor white people and other people and people of color. So he does a lot of work around that. But within that book, it's really maybe one chapter that I would lift up to you is something he uses called boundary theory, and also another related phrase is that of a cognitive shortcut. And what Wray does in this chapter is he says that human beings, there's something shared in our psychology that when we encounter things in the world and people in the world, that is natural to our psychology to put things and people and other into groups, so that we know, we have a sense of whether this thing is harmful to us or helpful to us or neutral. This can be benign, or it can be more harmful and dehumanizing when it comes to other groups of people, and that's what we'll talk about in a second. But he says, for instance, we take this for granted. It's so basic to our psychology and the way that we interact with the world. When we run into, let's say we're out on the street and somebody's walking their dog, and we have never met or seen this dog before, and we immediately see this four-legged animal and we put it into a certain group of dog or category of dog. And we, depending on our associations with that term, most people, not all, but most people find dogs to be friendly. They're not threats, they're not harmful. And so in the blink of an eye, we have already conceptually placed this creature that we've not interacted with before in a certain category, again, whether it being helpful or harmful. When we look at maybe a red fruit, there are certain things we look at to tell whether it's a tomato or an apple. Our minds are doing this conceptual work very quickly, not only to distinguish between those two types of food, but also to say whether this is something that would be harmful to us if we ate it or ingested it, or whether it will be tasty, or whether it would be concerning. Ray, the gist of this is Ray says that type of marking categories and putting boundaries around things so that we can conceptually know what we're interacting with just in a shorter way, so that we're not doing this work from scratch every single time we encounter a new phenomenon in our world. That's sort of how the human brain works. Now, from that, over the course of history, some of which Rachel will talk about in a minute, humans have found ways, of course, to categorize both ourselves and make identities for ourselves, and then also making identities for other people, and then also loading up those categories with lots and lots of stuff. And sometimes they're more innocent, other times they're much more harmful and dehumanizing. So for instance, over the centuries in the United States, in our American context, this is one example out of many, but blackness, to be black, has often been associated with being criminal or dangerous or lazy or threatening or something like that. And that's again, what is otherwise a natural way of marking categories out for ourselves to make our way through the world. Sometimes these things take on much more insidious and dehumanizing practices that then get woven into the structure of our society in ways that are not helpful and not fair and that are unjust, and they can be violent, or they can be just not the ways that we would want to live in the world. So I recommend that to you as a text. Sometimes it takes a little bit of the guilt off of what just seems to, based on some things around color blindness that also will be talked about later, that we can think of. But the larger point that Wray puts out there is that this is the way that our brains tend to work. That does not necessarily mean that we don't need to challenge that and that we can't unlearn some of those ways of thinking, that we can, through a lot of hard work and through a process, and gradually we can start to become more self-aware. Becoming aware that this is how our brains work is a good place to start. With that, I'm going to move over quickly to a few terms. First of all, bias, prejudice, and racism. I'm going to say racism for later. Bias simply can mean, as most of you know, a bias that often means something very bad in our context in the United States or in our language, to say, oh, you're biased, like that. It's weighted with, it's not a neutral term so much, but definitionally it is. It just simply means having a preference for one thing over another. So this can be harmless to say, I have a bias against McDonald's fast food. I have a preference instead for a Wendy's hamburger or something like that. Or I come from North Carolina, so I have a bias against, I'm a UNC Tar Heel basketball fan. I'm not a fan of Duke. I'm sorry, I know that's a more Methodist affiliated school, so I'm sorry to folks in the room, but I have a bias for UNC basketball, not for Duke basketball. That's a big division in our household and our family. Of course, biases can take on much more harmful and death-dealing and heavier and weightier ways. So to say, some people have biases against LGBTQ persons, or against Democrats, or against Republicans, or against immigrants, or Muslims, or people of color. The bias tends to work in that way in terms of having a preference, or linking to our next term, a prejudice, a sort of built-in suspicion or dislike for something. I have a preference for one thing, I also have a dislike for its counterpart or something other than the thing that I tend to like. Prejudice, of course, is related to bias. It means drawing conclusions about someone or something, oftentimes based on superficial or external or symbolic markers of identity. So in other words, what we usually mean by prejudice is that before we really take the time to get to know the essence of someone or a person or a group, we have already prejudged and have already leaned into the biases or the preferences or the dislikes that we sort of have built up around those categories or identity markers already. This leads lastly to racism, which we're going to talk about in two ways for the next 4 or 5 minutes. The first way, which would not be familiar to many, I'm sure, is we want to keep in mind that racism always and should be used in ways that speak to structural and systemic dynamics, ways that race is used as a identity marker, to go back to Matt Wray and his book and what I mentioned a minute ago. We use race to categorize ourselves and to categorize others. But racism, for a lot of scholars of race, want to bring into that conversation, one sort of cliche way to put it, and a helpful shortcut way to put it, is that it's prejudice plus power. And the power specifically is, like Matt talked about, the power of who owns the table. But it's power in the sense of social dynamics, cultural dynamics, political dynamics, who has power and how that power is being wielded, usually for racism, over against people categorized as being of a different race. That is on the structural side. We'll get back to that in a second. A way that a lot of people, though, tend to talk about it, that scholars have to push for that definition oftentimes, and as pastors, you may have to push for that in terms of bringing congregation members along. The opposite side of that, of course, is that most people think of racism in very personalized and individual ways. Racism is purely a matter of the negative or dehumanizing or prejudicial ways of thinking about other people that are nestled within my heart or within my head. Racism plays out simply by perhaps the jokes I tell or the language that I use. To go back to my home church that I mentioned at the opening of this, some people would feel that, oh, if I just quit using a racial slur, then I'm no longer racist, something to that effect. Of course, that is not a bad place to start, but it never gets to the social and systemic and structural ways that certain privileges and advantages are built in to our culture and system that people can take advantage of if they are belonging, in our case, if they're white and if they're belonging to the dominant group, or ways that they are then disadvantaged and do not have access to certain privileges or resources, or are treated with suspicion, or are treated as second class, or what have you, based on their particular racial dynamic or makeup, what's been prescribed in that sense. So notice that it's helpful to keep in mind that anyone can be prejudiced or biased. That's not a specifically white thing. People have prejudicial views of other folks. There's lots of examples for that, and we could talk about that in a Q&A perhaps. But when we get into things like racism or sexism or other types of discrimination, that we should always, and it's helpful to push and encourage others to think of the structural, systemic, cultural ways that that's baked in. That's beyond just a matter of what's in our heart or the things that we think or say as individual folks. The last category that I wanted to walk us through is that of white privilege. Which is a category that certainly has come much more to the forefront over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm sure we've started to hear a lot more about that. I don't know that that language was used as much outside of the last 4 or 5 years, but it was around, but it's become much more popular for people to talk about and to say and to use. It's a phrase that makes certain people uncomfortable. It makes some white people angry to hear the term. And it's also a very kind of messy term as well, that lots of people use it and lots of people use the term in different ways. Some ways that are helpful, some ways that are not. I think it's safe to say at its most basic, white privilege simply means the ways that in our society, and this looks different across region and place and things like that, but it's ways that the lives of white people, generally speaking, have access to greater amounts of resources, ways that we are oftentimes presumed to be innocent in more deeper symbolic ways, or in more straightforward ways in the legal justice system. What we have access to, things that we don't have to fight against, or things that negative assumptions that aren't cast our way just by default of who we are. What white privilege, lastly, is not, and this is important to say, there's a meme that has been circulating now for years, and there's some articles that are related to this that a quick Google search could help you find. But white privilege doesn't mean that white people's lives are necessarily easy or comfortable just because you're white. And the meme would say white privilege simply means that your life is not made harder because of our racial identity, that our whiteness does not then disadvantage us, but it makes us open to the possibilities. I come from a blue collar background, a working class background. I know and I've seen that there are lots of ways in which white people's lives may not be easy from a class perspective. And the phrase white privilege can seem to obscure that at times. But when we're talking about it, and for our purposes, it does not have to obscure that. And we should become better at keeping the intersectionality of this together, that race is a major form of identification in a way that patterns people's lives and our outcomes and chances in life. but there are other intersectional parts of that: gender, sexuality, class, region, where we live, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area, and what is there for you. So we can talk about that more, but just white privilege is a thorny phrase, and it's helpful in many ways. And in many ways, we need to make sure we get clear as time goes on about what is meant by it and what is not, because sometimes it can seem to put up a false barrier that the phrase or those who use it may not actually mean, but it's good to get clear about it. So I'm going to wrap up my section here, and I will pass this over now to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm always just really in awe listening to you. You break things down so clearly and so helpfully. And really, I'm just going to build on what Mark has already talked about to really kind of flesh out a bit further how race and racism work themselves out in general terms in US society and US history. So whether we want it to or not, our society has deep racial divides. As people who are living in the United States, we often don't have to look far to see examples of how we remain deeply divided and unequal in this country by race, by which racial group we are categorized in, or the ways that other people perceive us. And one way that race tends to show up in the US and also around the world is through differential life experiences of groups who are considered or classified as white and those that are considered to be non-white. So our society in particular tends to revolve around a hierarchy where those who are white are generally at the top and have more advantages, economic advantages, social advantages as a group than those who are classified or seen as non-white. And there's a hierarchy, and Black people and those who are perceived as Black are often at the bottom of this racial hierarchy for a lot of historical reasons that I'll talk about in just a minute, but also encourage you to do your own reading and education around. Historically, from the founding of the United States to the civil rights era too, our nation has held this dissonant reality. So white groups have been seen as worthy and deserving of the full rights and benefits of citizenship. Even white immigrant groups, sometimes people talk about the Irish, were eventually folded into the full understanding and expansion of what it means to be an American and to be protected under the law as a US citizen. That has not been the same for other groups. So American history is a history of indigenous erasure and genocide, the enslavement of African peoples, the exclusion and internment of Asian Americans, and the forced expulsion of Mexican people and other immigrants. And there's so much to learn about each of these things. And again, I encourage you to do some of that learning. Unfortunately, this legacy continues. In the past few months, we have had many harsh reminders that the post-civil rights assertion that all are equal under the law remains far from reality. So the ideal is still not a reality. Just kind of some examples of what that looks like. In 2020, most white Americans, myself included, can expect to generally be treated respectfully by authorities and given the benefit of the doubt. So most of us go through our daily lives not fearing that we may meet a violent death in an unanticipated encounter with the police, for example. And by and large, these expectations are met by our experiences in society. So I'm pulled over I am not immediately having it enter into my mind that I could die at the hands of the police simply by virtue of them misperceiving me as a violent criminal or threat. So people of color cannot expect the same, and Black people in particular, but this sort of goes across people of color, regardless of their class. So, you know, you could be a professor at Harvard, often face the ever-present danger that their everyday activities, such as jogging or sleeping, to name two recent cases, will increase the likelihood of being detained, harassed, or even dying as a result of these split-second assumptions about their perceived threat level. And if people of color are arrested or brought to trial, then they can expect to receive harsher sentences, be in jail longer, and generally have a more negative experience with our criminal justice system. And if you would like to know more about that in particular, I would highly recommend reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. Additionally, there has been a wealth gap, as many of us maybe have experienced in our own lives, in our families, that's been growing since the 1970s, where those at the top of American society have gotten richer, where middle class and poor folks have really struggled and to see a better life and to see gains. This has only been deepened within Black households. So in 2016, the average wealth of Black households was $17,150 compared to the average wealth of white households. And I'm curious what some of you think that that would be. It is nearly 10 times higher. The average white wealth in a white household is $171,000 compared to Black families, where the average is $17,000 and $150,000. So I know that this varies again according to region, but these are huge gaps that really shape people's experiences in our country. Black families are 40% less likely to own their own house than white families. And on average, Black men make 87 cents for every dollar that white men make. It won't be surprising to you that in our current moment, what we've been wrestling with as a nation is that, like, on top of some of the violent deaths that we've seen of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, there's been also this backdrop of, you know, I heard someone once talk about it recently as two pandemics. There's been the COVID-19 pandemic, and then there's been the pandemic of racism that we've had for centuries. So we've had these two pandemics that have been surfacing in our society. And when it comes to COVID-19, communities of color have been disproportionately impacted, in part because of the inequalities that I just discussed. So Black Americans have a higher rate of death than other racial groups. They are more likely to be frontline workers. They're more likely to be essential workers. The same goes for Latinx communities. And they're more likely to be exposed to COVID and hospitalized. And the problem, I think, with all of this is that our fellow human beings, our siblings, are denied opportunities, in some cases for centuries, to flourish and experience a sense of freedom of movement and opportunity, and instead have really had repetitive and generational experiences of being subjected to fear and danger just in the course of their daily lives. And this is something that I think we should all care about. I mean, it's not to say that we shouldn't, that white people shouldn't, you know, strive to enjoy the benefits of our citizenship, or that we shouldn't seek to provide for ourselves and our families. But it is to say that there's nothing inherently superior or special about us as white people, that we would somehow deserve these things over others. All people deserve to have their human rights and dignities respected, to live in a society that works for them and that values them. And the more that I think I personally have learned about the differences of experiences and the daily struggles that communities of color and people of color go through, the more that I just cannot sit with the dissonance that is part of our different realities by virtue of just how we happen to have been born into the world. Mark already discussed, the concept of white privilege, and another way to talk about white privilege is that we're referring to the unearned social benefits that that people accrue based on their physical appearance. So if I'm white, I just naturally get assumptions of innocence, safety. People feel more comfortable around me, versus when my Black colleagues enter a space, how they're likely to be perceived. This is a problem, and one we have to grapple with and wrestle with. There's also this idea that there's structural white advantage. So on a social or a group level, now regardless of whether I individually want that or not, whiteness is the unspoken foundation of what appears normal or valuable or desirable in our society. And that's the case because white people on the whole enjoy more access to wealth and power. So certainly not all white people are powerful or wealthy, but we have access in many ways to, or we have people who look like us who are in positions of wealth and power. And so our leaders, that means that our leaders will have a higher chance that our needs and our voices and our experiences will be taken into account by our elected representatives, by other people in positions of power, whereas the needs and voices and experiences of people of color are less likely to be considered. Another thing to think about is how white privilege shows up in our daily life. So something that I think that I have come to understand, but it was very mind-blowing when I first realized it, was that we have the ability as white people to move through life being racially unmarked. And what I mean by that is that in the majority of contexts that I am in, my race is not going to be a relevant factor in shaping my interactions with other white people, businesses, or police in a negative way. It actually might work the opposite way and be a factor in giving me positive treatment. People of color, though, on the other hand, constantly are facing surveillance and suspicion, as I've said, by virtue of their race, just in doing their daily life activities. Another more subtle way that white privilege can impact our daily lives, I think, is that because our race affords us experiences that are by and large positive as a group and in our society, that we have experiences of worthiness, respect, belonging, inclusion, that these sort of come to us easier by virtue of our race. We often tend to assume unconsciously then when we're in our environments, in our schools, in our churches, that this is the standard for everyone, that everyone can experience this or does experience this, and that's really not the case. The just natural sense of being worthy, deserving of respect, belonging. There are so many messages in our society that tell Black people and other people of color that they don't belong, that they're not worthy, simply by the color of their skin or how their racial identity is perceived. They are told that they are criminal or they are out of place. And this is a problem because it allows us as white people to have a kind of innocence. It's not a true innocence. It's a sort of it's a false way of understanding the reality of our world, but it prevents us from really seeing the life and death realities of people who are facing the impact, the lived impact of racial injustice. Because we're often very isolated then and segregated and insulated from their struggles and their experience, because we just assume that our experiences are the experiences of others. And that's why it's so important that we make time and space in our lives to listen rather than getting defensive, to listen to the powerful prophetic words and truth of people of color in this moment in our country who are speaking very explicitly about their present and their past experience. So as long as these kinds of systems remain invisible to us, we aren't going to be able to change our own behavior or confront unjust structures, and that means that we can't move closer to building the society and the communities that we really long for, where everyone is valued and feels like their contributions are affirmed and celebrated, and that there's opportunities for them to flourish. And Matt's going to talk a little bit more about now for our final section about how this shows up in the context of the church and how we can move into a more liberated way of being.
Rachel, thanks so much. I grew up in a suburb of Dallas in a Methodist church and was taught, hopefully as all of us were taught as Christians, that the ground is level at the foot of the cross, that we're all same in the eyes of Jesus. And when it came to race, the way that kind of took on language and concept was that we are all same in the eyes of Jesus, and that we need to really kind of adopt what has been come to known as color blindness. And while the impetus of that may be good in a Christian context, that there's a sameness, there should be equity, that we're connected to each other based on this dynamic of Jesus. All of our social relationships, in a sense, ordered differently. What it often does is it operates at a different level too, so that white folks don't have to take the particular identity, history, experience of African American or people of color into account. And because of that, it perpetuates it. It blinds us from seeing the distinctions in the history and the experience. And it also can work as a profound form of denial. So when we say that race doesn't matter at all, it really prevents us from then grappling with how it actually does, how it works. Because as Rachel said, if race determines health outcomes and education and level of income and incarceration and how you get a loan, it can be a way of avoiding racialized issues in our church and in our culture. And so as long as we kind of differentially treat the experience and it remains invisible, we don't really then have the need to look at our own behaviors. We won't look at our own behaviors. We don't have to. And so this means that it's really difficult in working towards equity when we've already started at a place where we're blinding ourselves, or that's part of it. Part of that too, I think, is this idea of a theology of racial reconciliation. And as I have started walking down this road, I've begun to realize that there's some problems in that the theology of reconciliation is deeply Jewish by nature, in that God is working to create covenant between human beings and God's own self, and that there's reconciliation between God and human beings, and that there should be this relational reconciliation between that. But as my Black colleague asked me one time, Matt, what part of American history do I want to be reconciled to, right? Which kind of caught me flat-footed, and I began to think, that's really interesting. Because for there to be reconciliation, theologically, spiritually, relationally, there first has to be conciliation. And so we can think conceptually of a conciliation, maybe theologically or within our own kind of constructs of Genesis. But when we think that sociologically, relationally, it's very difficult. And so part of the move I think that we have to make is from solidarity to, or from reconciliation to solidarity. Because often what we do as white folks, reconciliation is kind of this sense of if we can get along, if we can become friends. So friendship is kind of sits at the corner or at the center of all of this. And if we can become friends, we can just kind of work it out together. Where our friends of color are saying, actually, friendship is not the goal. Solidarity is. The work of equity, of human flourishing, that's the goal. Now, maybe friendship will come out of this. Maybe there will be something that will be even deeper than friendship, which will be covenant, would come out of this. But that is not the goal. The work towards the kingdom of these social relationships ordered differently, where Jesus is attending to these things in the Spirit is. And so this work of mutual collaboration, I think, that sits at the heart of this then. And part of the way that we're understanding this at as Project Curate is a way that Adrienne Marie Brown talks in her book, Emergent Strategies, or Emergent Strategy, which I think is a great book. And her notion of the fractals, which you'll see a picture on the slide. A fractal is a never-ending pattern. There's infinite complexes of that pattern that are similar across different scales. And so you go to the cosmos and you see what's similar to this picture that's on the slide. And they're created by repeating simple processes over in an ongoing loop and a feedback. So partly what we're understanding the hope is in these collaborative relationships that we can form as United Methodists, as Christians in the world, is where there's not a hierarchy, but there's a shared sense of power. And there's a deep sense that we're committed to whatever we want to see in the macro, whatever we want to see happen in the macro. We are deeply committed in our structures in churches and our organizations and the way that we comport ourselves for that to be what exists in the micro, in this contextual. So whatever is going to happen in the macro, it's got to start in the micro we're at. And there's got to be a deep sense which there is that scale and that reframe. And so I'll turn it over to Mark now and let him share some of his thoughts on that.
Thanks, Matt. I will just briefly share, I'm cognizant of the time. I will briefly share that my work in Lake Providence in the Louisiana Delta, and in previous places where I've lived and ministered and worked before, I tend to think of this work through the lens of salvation. Where I grew up, in the Baptist tradition in which I grew up, salvation was very much a matter of, where you go when you die, doing the right thing or believing the right thing so that one can avoid hell and go to heaven. And of course, over the years of theological education I received, my mind was open to the idea that salvation also entailed matters of God's justice, coming to earth, God's reign breaking through and into present realities. I think of all the things that concern the prophets, about injustice and suffering and oppression, and things that concern Mary and Mary's Magnificat, upon the time of Jesus's birth. Things that Jesus introduced in the beginning of his ministry, quoting the prophet Isaiah in Luke chapter 4, that he was here to bring sight to the blind and to liberate those in bondage, and that salvation for the Jewish and Jewish Christian traditions has always been tied up with matters of God's peace and God's justice materializing in the world, and that the call to be a Christian and the call to discipleship is to participate alongside of the Spirit and alongside of God in that ministry in the world. And so places where human beings are made to suffer unnecessarily because of racial injustice and racial privilege. And that can be expanded to other types of dehumanizing oppressions that exist in our world too, alongside race, wherever it is that Christians can participate in, both internally within ourselves, but also, with the systems and the cultures in which we live, ways that we engage those so that we can make our communities, lead our communities to look more like those things that the prophets were concerned about and that Jesus and in his ministry was concerned about, and Mary and others, that is not disconnected from the salvific work of Christ and the salvation that God is breaking into within our world. And we use concepts like the kingdom of God or the reign of God or the realm of God to speak to that. But that's part of the salvation that's happening and that the Christian witness points toward. I will stop there. I see that it's 3. Perhaps we can have some more conversation later. Thank you.
Well, Project Curate, I think we might be at that point where we can maybe ask you guys some questions. Would that be okay? I see some nodding of the head. We've had several questions submitted to us via the Q&A feature. So if you have a chance and have a question, please do so by submitting to the Q&A. This is one. This particular question here says, this person says they are a white male. They know that they are a product of white privilege, but sometimes fear speaking out because they could say the wrong thing. Take, for instance, Drew Brees and the comments about standing for the national anthem a few months ago. He was almost universally roasted for his comments, for expressing his opinion, even though there were some voices of color who agreed with him. The question is, how do I, as a white male, speak against racism in the right way? How do we begin to address these subjects?
I would say cautiously, thoughtfully, not out of a heated emotional response. There are ways that my whiteness will rear its head, and just to be honest and transparent, I don't have it all together on my side. But what I have learned is that it might be better for me to sit on things for when the opportunity presents itself. If I can sit and think about it and I can wrestle with that emotion first, or if not, do some homework, Google search a couple things, go through my phone to see what the whole story might be. If I'm looking at a certain instance or thing that's happened, remember that things get sensationalized occasionally or often through social media, and just do my homework and be thoughtful first, and to know that there's not one singular right way to do it, and that where I am in life, I'm 36 years old, and I look back at the ways that I've talked about racial issues over the years, and good gracious, it's been an evolution and it's changed, and things that may seem right today, I will probably still be learning from in the future. So some humility helps, and being gracious to oneself helps, but also being open to listening and being thoughtful helps too.
I find too that something that, well, maybe we'll talk about this in our next session, and hopefully, whatever we're able to not get to this time, we can really come back to in our next session. But I find that something that's really hard for white people is that we want to be right. We want to know that we're like good white people and that we have the right answers and we have the right things to say. And so if we're expecting that we're going to go into the work of confronting racism without and that we can just sort of get it right and prove that all of a sudden we're not racist and we're anti-racist and we have it down, we are going to, I am constantly reminded that that's not the case. The fear of getting it wrong shouldn't impede us from being teachable and open to learning. But I agree with everything that Mark said, that sometimes it's also really important to really pause and reflect on our responses and work through our emotions and really check ourselves before we utter opinions. And that's where it's also very important to do our reading and listen to the voices of people of color. But I am constantly making mistakes and learning.
And I would only add that the times I've made the biggest mistakes is when I have not paused, when I have either sent the text or the tweet or the Facebook post, and have not really kind of done that more contemplative move towards kind of both deconstructing both the emotions and maybe the culture that it's coming out of, maybe even with a trusted friend working that through before I respond. And so I think that we have a community of trust within our that we could build that would be able to help us not necessarily respond as individuals, but as a collection of relationships that can help us with those responses.
This next question was submitted to us just prior to going on the air. And it is a somewhat personal question, but there's no one attached to it. So the question begins this way. Some of our local areas in Louisiana remain deeply racist. I think many of us know that. This particular pastor serves a congregation whose leadership wanted them to hang up a Confederate flag on the parsonage, was upset when they allowed a person of color to guest preach from the pulpit, and told them that the worst thing that ever happened to them was integration. This pastor admits, though, that progress is happening, albeit slowly. They can now call racism a sin from the pulpit without having the DS call them. The question is, how do we help our white congregants who feel as though they are the ones who are oppressed and taken advantage of by people of color understand that they are often, actually, most often, the oppressors themselves? I know that's a deep question.
I'll jump in. First of all, bless your heart. I'm a Southerner, so I use that phrase with all sincerity. That's a tall order, of issues to work with. The first thoughts that come to mind is that this isn't the kind of thing you do overnight, and it might be work that exceeds one individual pastor's time. It can be a slow, long, messy process. I think it's helpful to remember that progress is always relative to where the beginning point is. So it can, what looks like progress in certain places, you need to be scaled back or framed differently for other places. And that's never to soft pedal how racist beliefs, impact others or operate in the world. I've often used, and I'll bring my response to a close with this. I've often used the analogy of going to counseling or going to therapy in terms of thinking about how we work with people and racist mindsets or beliefs, like this belief of victimhood, that they are being oppressed, the white person's being oppressed, and things like that. This does not make for a neat, easy answer, but usually those types of beliefs are very deeply rooted and deeply seated. And just as if a person went to a therapist would most likely not say to them, they wouldn't fix them in the first session. Or it fixes even a strong word, but like that, this is a long, slow process. I've also made the comment before that a lot of the language of being woke, woke to realities of injustice, things like that a lot of woke people, it took them a long time to get there. It took a lot of education and a lot of resources and a lot of professors or pastors or friends or colleagues, people who walk alongside of us to get them there. So I think just to say, keep loving that person, keep having a trusting relationship, keep finding ways to hold people accountable in ways that are relative to where they're beginning, and just know that, again, like any other psychological matter, addressing racism is not like just flipping a switch in somebody's mind or just giving them the right bit of information and that then therefore eradicates everything. It's a long process. It's a slow process, and it's not easy. So thank you for your work that you're doing.
All right, let's continue with some questions. Thank you for that feedback, Mark, as helpful. This is, again, a very similar question to maybe the one before, and it really gets to, I think, what people are asking, or at least what I'm seeing in the question and answer, is the practical how. This question here, I agree with much of what the speakers are saying, but communicating this to others seems to require a great deal of social theory, historical understanding, cultural awareness. There's a lot to it, right? I know many people who have no interest in or are opposed to viewing the world through that particular lens. Is there a way to approach these issues without the scholarly focus?
You know, I would say yes, because I think I come at this more as a pastor than a scholar. And I would say, though, while the scholarship can help us understand, it is a deeply complicated set of social, spiritual, relational, familial movements that we're up against that are all kind of together. And so I think the scholarship can help us in some ways untangle some of the strands, but we live in a world that wants to kind of reduce everything to one side or the other. And I think within this, there's a call to enter into some of the more complicated elements of it. You know, people do things for a lot of different reasons. They do things for both political reasons. They also do things because they're deeply wounded. There's a lot of anxiety, hurt, depression, mental health issues that are going on. And so I think that one of the ways we're attempting to approach this is to lay these things out, but also to understand that we live in a really deeply complicated time in history, and we're deeply complicated people. And so that if we can gather information that attends to that, and we can untangle some of these threads, that we might be able to walk them back a little. We also may be able to understand why Paul in the New Testament says, why do I do the things I don't want to do? You know, there may be a cultural aspect of that as well. Why are we doing these things? And that we can take a couple different strands and look at them through that way. That's been my approach as a non-scholar coming to this more as a pastor than from a scholarship point of view.
Thank you, Matt. Next question. Many good-hearted people I love and respect who are resistant to these conversations see systemic racism as an illusion created by liberal scholars. One of the questions that they have been asked is, why do they get to define the language? Why do they get to define the language? They feel like the language frames the conversation against them. What is some of the work that we can do as white people to help remove some of the emotional weight that words like racism and white fragility have for people? So the weight of the words, right? They're confrontational, if you will, in some respect.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I would say that we have to use whatever language. I mean, we have to be aware that, you know, to think, you know, like any conversation that you have, you're going to find the language that that really fits with the context and the conversation. So the way that I talk to my mom about race and racism, you know, my parents are evangelical, middle class, vote Republican, you know, they're there's a way that I'm going to talk with them that may look different, but my fundamental sort of commitments are not going to change about what I think. And so this is just me personally, about what I understand to be the problem and how we address it. So I think that there's a tension, right? Because you don't want to use language that is so loaded and has this baggage with it that it shuts people down because they just see it as so irrelevant, or they associate it with a group that they don't hold in high esteem, whether it's intellectuals or scholars or women or a political party. So there is kind of an awareness that has to happen there. But on the other hand, like, we can't whitewash to an extent, and maybe Matt and Mark will have a slightly different take on this, but we can't remove the emotional impact of words like racism. There's a reason why people react strongly to these words. It's either a reality that they're uncomfortable facing for whatever reason, or that these words are pointing to a reality that's not pleasant to engage with. And it's most of the time not going to make those of us who are white, who are part of the reason this system continues, it's not going to make us feel good. And so that's the challenge, is learning how to sit with our discomfort, but also not being so inflammatory that we shut people down. Because I know that there was a time in my life where I had to take very baby steps in my own journey, and words that I could tolerate now, I couldn't tolerate then. So that's, again, it's very messy work. But Mark, what is your take, or Matt, on language and how it's used and the scholarly versus kind of the everyday speak?
I think that's a very interesting question. I do get caught up in language a lot, because not just out of scholarly interest, but because I always have, what's always in the back of my mind is anything that I've studied over the years. What would this look like if I was talking to somebody back in my home congregation? Where the stories I told earlier would probably tip my hat towards how they might feel about the work I do, or what things I'm concerned about. What I don't want to underestimate, though, is there are, to use biblical language, there are powers and principalities out there who have a vested interest in white supremacy, and who have a vested interest in the political gains that or economic gains that are accomplished by stoking animosity around the category of race. That whatever language people come up with the best of intentions, that language always has the potential to be weaponized and to gin up that same type of animosity or uncomfortable feelings. So while it is very helpful to think carefully about the language that we use, it can also be like a game of whack-a-mole at some point, because some folks are, whether we talk about ideas of confirmation bias or whatever it is, some of that stuff is so psychologically rooted within us that we'll turn to the word that is created by scholars, or liberal, conservative, whatever, and we can then find ways that also is problematic and should be tossed out, so that we can avoid ever having the conversation to start with. So it's not easy, but yeah.
I would also say that we have language within our own faith that is pretty explosive, that in terms of kind of the liberation of human people. And so it's not that, these things get kind of placed on scholarship or different schools of thought. But I think within our own Christian tradition, there's this language of equity, this language of crossing boundaries and border crossing, this language of this teleological, this kind of deep move there, where really at the reign of Jesus, there's a different world order. And that is when we're praying, let your kingdom come. That's part of what we're asking, that we would be participating in whatever it's going to look like, that we're doing that stuff now. And so that's not right or left or up or down. That's Jesus stuff. And so part of it is the call to get back to the Jesus stuff, and to whatever Jesus is doing in the world to do that. I think part of it is that when anything gets politicized, in a sense that because there's an agenda underneath that my side will win. But when you stick Jesus at the heart of it, and there's love at the heart of it, then it's really about this collective sense that we all are in this together and everybody has to win, right? And so I think that's part of the call of what it means to instantiate the gospel and our Christian faith right now.
Thanks, everyone. We have one more question, and it's very, very similar to a question that I asked on the podcast that we produced prior to this. And the question is essentially that a lot of times when you look at these, especially when it comes to systemic racism, systems that have been put in place generations before, it can just be completely overwhelming. They understand individual racism and how to deal with that, but the question is the overwhelming nature of systemic racism. Overanalysis can lead to paralysis. What is your reaction to how all of us can instead continue to do the work and not be overwhelmed by what is a very deep and systemic problem?
That has been a challenge every single day that I've lived in the Louisiana Delta. My goodness. In the Delta, East Carroll, Madison, Tensall, Concordia, those parishes, making your way down south to Baton Rouge, poverty levels are extremely high, as you most likely know if you're living and working in Louisiana. They're high elsewhere in Louisiana, to be sure. In Lake Providence, we've been called the poorest town in the country back by Time Magazine back in the 90s. 2014, CNN was in Lake Providence and said we had the widest disparity in family wealth of any place in the country. Those articles can be found. It is, it's overwhelming. And I don't know that there's a single way to just avoid that feeling. I think it's more of a matter of self-care in the midst of it. 63% of our children live in poverty and income. Oh, I'm muted, sorry. Our median income is around $18,000 or $19,000. All I can say, if you're working in a similar context, find good people that can keep you going and that you can keep them going, because burnout is a serious possibility, my goodness, and feeling overwhelmed and feeling like it just doesn't matter, it's too big of a problem to solve, and some nihilism or cynicism can creep in. That was it's been my biggest hurdle, being in Lake Providence, and knowing that, again, it's a matter of the scale we use to measure progress. Not comparing myself to things that I see other people doing in larger organizations in other parts of the country. The scale has to be different. I also have learned to not be afraid of making messy alliances. And by that, I mean, there is a tendency, I'm a pretty liberal guy, just to be honest about it. And there's a tendency amongst some people of my ilk to engage in purity politics, and that you shouldn't, engage with certain people if they hold certain beliefs, or that you should be skeptical of this or that. And living in the Delta disabused me of that notion very quickly, because there are people with all sorts of beliefs that are different from my own, theologically, politically, socially. And what I have had to try to do are find places and individuals and people where we can work on certain projects together, if that alleviates some suffering and makes a dent in the poverty there. And then there are other projects that they're going to want to do that I'm not going to be a part of, and vice versa, and that's okay. But learning that relationships can be messy and that we can work together where we can, and not to, if I was playing that purity game, then I don't know that I would ever work with anybody, and then nothing would get done, and that's just no way to do it. And so not to be afraid to work with folks. and just to again, self-care.
I would just add, I mean, overanalysis can lead to paralysis, definitely, you know, and that's why it's important to remember that this work isn't about learning the right answer or the right term or the right language. Next week, it's going to be a different term. We're going to decide that white fragility, I mean, already, we're talking about white fragility next week. There's a whole host of articles out there that are talking about why white fragility is the wrong term, you know. So it's not about kind of the right language, getting this right, learning all the head knowledge. It's about the way we live. It's about the daily choices that we make in our relationships, and learning to be okay with the long, lifelong, messy, hard work that is, you know, learning to live into a new way of being. And, you know, for me, it's been, you know, like decades now of really struggling with my own whiteness. But one of the things that really heartens me is that we're on this webinar today, and all of you are on this webinar with us. Probably about five years ago, I was feeling so burnt out and very, very isolated. Actually, probably about the time when I met Mark. Because I felt like I'd had this awakening, but I felt so isolated. And I didn't have other white people or other community spaces, particularly in Christian spaces, that I felt like that we could hold each other in the wrestling and in the real life and flesh and blood ways of trying to live this stuff out. And what I think is so powerful now is that we're forming new connections and new spaces for white people in particular to talk to other white people, and so that we can be like, oh, okay, like, how did you work through this? What points of fear came up for you? What defensiveness came up for you? What in your family have you had to wrestle with, or in your community? And so that's really where I think that actually keeps us moving, and we just have to keep going. You know, it's not we solve it overnight. It's what is the next best elegant step that we can take to continue the journey, and then we find other people to journey with us.
I would only add something that I heard Willie Jennings say recently, in that hope is a discipline. And that our because we are, the things that we're up against in our own lives personally, in our families, and cultural writ large is overwhelming. And I think that's why hope ends up having to be a discipline that we nurture in our relationships, this community of hope, that it could be different. And my hunch is that we're going to get to the end of our lives, and we're going to pass a baton off to the other generation, and they're going to experience the same things we did, in a sense that they're going to have to go and work as hard as they can to understand the kingdom and to work out their faith with fear and trembling. And at the end of the day, they're going to come and they're going to have to pass that on. And so we have to continue towards the discipline of hope.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all of you who are with us today. The attendance has been great, and we thank you so very much for carving time out of your day. As I said in the beginning, we know you have other things to do. I know Bishop Harvey has some final words and then a closing prayer for all of us. So let's hear from Bishop Harvey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. I think someone asked in the chat, I think there's been a little over 100 people at the most amount of time. Most everybody hung in there for the whole time, so I'm grateful for that. And I know these are incredibly busy times. Some of you pastors just moved, so I know that you're probably still unpacking, and so I just really appreciate the fact that you continue to be a part of these conversations. I'm constantly looking for hope. That is just who I am. And I'm encouraged by the vulnerability and the depth and the honest questions that you ask in the chat. And so I'm going to ask you in our future conversations, we give you the opportunity to ask some of those questions in advance, and it shapes how Project Curate comes into the conversation. So use that time, because that's really, really important in this time, because that's what gives me hope. Your willingness to enter into these very vulnerable, hard conversations, and to say, you know, this is my struggle. This is what I grapple with, because we all do. So your mere presence gives me hope. The vulnerability of your questions gives me great hope. Hanging in there with this gives me great hope. And I think, Mark, you said it so well. Right now, there is no question that you are the learning curve for all of us, for everything that we're doing today, whether it's a conversation on race. I actually had a Black colleague say to me, I've had to relearn some of my Black history. There's Black History Month, but we don't know a lot of our own Black history. So that's really telling to me. So we've got this COVID-19, we've got race, we've got an economic challenge, we've got all of these things sort of getting conflated into this time. I know that's hard, and I know you're exhausted. I know you are exhausted, because you're having to learn something new every day, every single day. And for all the letters I get on this issue of race, they're sitting in your pews or virtually. They're sitting there. So I know that you struggle with this, and you grapple with this, and you want to do the right thing. I know that language is difficult, and I know that we're not always going to say the perfect thing, the most right thing. To say something is really important. To stay silent is not the right thing to do. So find a friend, test your stuff out. That's what I do. And even some of the Council of Bishops letters I've sent, I test them out on some colleagues, because I'm not just going to do that blindly. So thank you. You give me hope. So I went to a hymn for my closing prayer. And don't worry, I'm not going to sing. But this is from The Faith We Sing. It's hymn 2186, Song of Hope, Canto de Esperanza. So hear this as our parting word. Dios de la esperanza, danos gozo y paz. Al mundo en crisis, habla tu verdad. Dios de la justicia, mándanos tu luz. Luz y esperanza en las ciudades. Oremos por la paz. Cantemos de tu amor. Luchemos por la paz, fieles a ti, Señor. May the God of hope go with us every day, filling all our lives with love and joy and peace. May the God of justice speed us on our way, bring light and hope to every land and race. Praying, let us work for peace. Singing, share our joy with all. Working for a world that's new. Faithful when we hear Christ's call. So go in peace and go in hope. Amen.